Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate being invited to come here and give a speech today. I'm gonna try and make it short, because I know everyone's done. It feels good to be done. I hope to feel like you guys do, and be done. So in thinking about, I was told that I could come and talk about pretty much decide anything that I could want to talk about. And so I was thinking about talking about the iPhone because it's so popular and everyone loves it. How many people have an iPhone? So a lot of people. So I was thinking about the iPhone and thinking about globalization and the other and inclusion and what I was going to be able to do in talking about the iPhone and what is involved with manufacturing the iPhone and how to start a discussion with you all and what to let you guys go home with and talking about globalization and self-preservation and exploitation and fairness. So I really wanted to start a discussion about the iPhone and its employment of underage children to manufacture the iPhone. And with that, I wanted to talk about long hours and low pay and working in so-called underdeveloped countries. And I was thinking about that and what I wanted to say, and then I definitely, in regard to the iPhone, wanted to talk about the 20 suicides by employees from 2007 up until now of employee workers who manufacture the iPhone. I especially wanted to talk about, of the 20 suicides, all but 2 involve falling from buildings to their deaths. And what does that mean, and the nature of those suicides, and what does that have to do with the iPhone and the fact that these underage children are making this iPhone to market to kids between 18 and 25 to use the iPhone in the Western world, and how is that adding up to cultural assimilation and the swallowing up of people and of culture. And then on Saturday, July 13th of 2013, there was the not guilty verdict of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin in America. And in a sense, my whole world stopped. I forgot about the iPhone, I forgot about globalization, I forgot about the unfair treatment of children and low wages, and all of a sudden I was thinking about, this is a really old issue that keeps coming back into my life, into my friend's life. This keeps becoming a discussion that keeps revolving around and talking about racism and segregation. I also wanted to come here today and talk about Facebook as well. And I wanted to talk about this sort of false idea of these overarching communities in Facebook, all these group pages and all these ways that we can sort of belong. And in my sense, in my mind, I'm saying it as these 1 foot in, 1 foot out communities. These communities don't actually ask you to be present. They don't ask you to show up really. They just ask you to sort of press a like. I like it. And I was wondering, what does that do to the critical mind? What does that do to the critique of art, the creation of art, when I can sort of just make a statement on a status or make a statement or create a picture and someone can just like it? They don't have to say how they like it. They don't have to say how it relates to them. They don't have to give me any sort of constructive feedback on how it could be better, how it relates, how it doesn't relate. They can just like it. They can't even unlike it. They can just like it or ignore it. And this sense of this instant creation, but also an instant validation by the number of likes or if any likes that you get. And so I was talking with my friends about what topic should I talk about and what should I mention. And we were discussing blogs. Is blogs the new news? And is YouTube the new live art? And we're talking about all these new things in the millennium. And this new media, this nice buzzword of the new media. And where is it headed? And what does that mean for us as artists? And we're not consumers, we're artists. And don't think of me as a consumer. And all of that. And then on this day, when this not guilty verdict came about, I was suddenly pressed with a lot of old things, a lot of legacy, a lot of heritage of old racism, of old segregation, of old issues of difference that still result in murder today, or pain, or violence, right? And I can even, if I wanted to, tie that into globalization, tie that into low wages for workers, if we want to really look at that as the extension of violence, the extension of oppression, of a cultural assimilation. So I don't know how much you guys know about the Trayvon Martin situation. I'm personally up to my neck in information. That doesn't mean you are. And so I don't want to feel like a pansy in repeating it all, but I want to talk about a specific instance that in regards to this situation. So just a quick recap, okay? Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old black male living in Florida. And on February 26th of 2012, he was murdered. Now, because he was murdered, we don't really know how his murder came to be necessarily, but what we do know is what's recorded. Now, George Zimmerman was a member of the neighborhood watch in his community, although that day he was not working, the day that Trayvon was murdered. And he saw Trayvon walking in the rain with a hoodie on, walking in the rain, sort of walking about, looking curious, but not really walking with a deliberate action. So George Zimmerman, from his car, calls 911 and says, there's this strange male walking about, and I think he's on drugs or something. And 911 says, is he black, white, Hispanic? I goes, I think he's black. And he goes, well, are you following him right now, the 911 person says? He goes, yes, I am. He goes, okay, we don't need you to do that. Stop following him, and we'll send someone to the scene. Okay, that's what we know happened. Next thing we know from the autopsy from Trayvon Martin is that he was killed with a gunshot to the chest. That's all that we know. After that, all we can go off of is what George Zimmerman then says occurred, which I don't want to repeat, but what he says happened is that Trayvon Martin came up to him, a fight ensued, he feared for his life, and he shot Trayvon Martin. The importance of explaining that the rest that occurs we don't really know is because before anything happens, before Trayvon and George Zimmerman speak to each other or even identify each other, we know that George Zimmerman thought he was suspicious and that he was black. That's all he knows. Over the course of time, he was killed on February 22nd of 2012. In the next year, Trayvon Martin's parents pushed the press really hard and pushed the local communities to bring charges on George Zimmerman, because initially the police ruled it as self-defense and said, okay, you can go. After 5 hours of interrogation, of course, and said, you can go. And Trayvon Martin's parents knew he was unarmed, knew he was 7 days new to the neighborhood, and felt that this was a gross injustice. They also did not think that their son entered a fight with George Zimmerman, but our parents always run for us, and that's great. So, so they all have speculative reasons as to what George Zimmerman's account of what happened. Eventually, February of this year, I think, is when it happened. Charges were brought about George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. Now, it could have been second-degree murder, it could be manslaughter, that all shook out later on. But he was charged for the murder, and then the trial came June-ish of this year. My one big grievance with this whole case is, yes, it's a not guilty verdict. But my real problem with this case is that I was following Facebook, I was following the blogs, I was reading what all the correspondents have to say about this issue, and they continually kept saying, well, this has nothing to do with race. This is a gun violence issue because he was shot and killed. This is a gun violence problem, but this has nothing to do with race. This is a self-defense issue. There's a stand your ground law in Florida, which means that if I feel that my life is in danger, I can shoot you without ever having run. I don't have to run from you. And I don't have to defend myself. I can use my gun to shoot you if I feel my life is in danger. Stand your ground. And so a lot of debate about stand your ground laws. There's a lot of debate about gun violence today, so we can all piggyback on all the gun violence murders this year. But the one thing that just angered me was that people said, this has nothing to do with race. Well, what got George Zimmerman out of his car? What got George Zimmerman to call 911 is that he saw with his eyes a black male who looked suspicious. Not suspicious because he was peeking in windows, not suspicious because he was acting, erratically on the street, just because he saw a black male walking down the street in a neighborhood, and that was suspicious. So in my opinion, it starts with race. There's just no other way to describe it. It is a race issue right off the bat. We can argue, should he have been shot? We can argue if there was a fight. There's been a lot of publicity about, was he an honor roll student? There was THC in his system from 2 weeks ago, so he was a pothead, he was a thug. But at the end of the day, 911 was called because he looked suspicious because he looked black, before we can get to anything else. I also, on my Facebook page, also to make connections to, and I always do this anyways, anything that goes on today, I go, well, where do we get that thinking from? Where inside is that coded in us, where we get that from? Because we're not islands, right? And we're not just born onto ourselves as independent as we want to think we are. We are getting a lot of what we think from somewhere else. And so in thinking about this, I instantly put up a picture. A lot of pictures you would see on Facebook. We're talking about hoodies and Skittles, because he had Skittles on his person because he was walking from 7-Eleven, and saying, well, if it's not about race, what else made him look suspicious? This is the med students at Howard University, which is a primarily black university in Washington, D.C. And they all wore their hoodies one day and said, do we look suspicious? We're all med students, but we are also all black. Would we be considered suspicious? And then are we worth dying for that? And then, of course, at the bottom, they're all in their med coats. Also, too, Ebony magazine is a primarily black magazine. They also, too, ran a campaign. These are different issues for the same month, I believe, of people in their hoodies saying, we are all Trayvon, because we are all black. And are we suspicious? The top group in the left is Spike Lee, who's a black director. To the right is Dwayne Wade, he's a basketball player in the NBA. The left is Trayvon's brother, mother, and father. To the right is an actor. And so they all ran this campaign right after the not guilty verdict saying, we are Trayvon. And you may have seen some of that stuff. So I put this picture up the day of the not guilty verdict on Saturday because it immediately made me think of this. This person is Emmett Till. He grew up in Chicago. In August of 1955, he asked his mom, could he go to Mississippi to visit his family? Now, his mom was very hesitant of this because of something called the Jim Crow South in America. Do you guys know, who knows about what Jim Crow South is, Jim Crow laws? Okay, so that's good, I get to talk about it. Okay, so his mom did not want him to go because of Jim Crow laws in the South. And so let me explain that a little bit. So Jim Crow laws. At the end of slavery in 1865, something popped up, not really popped up, but laws were devised called the Jim Crow laws, right? Jim Crow was a racist stereotype of black people and how they act and dance and stuff, but that's what they just started deeming it. And basically just upheld segregation in the South, primarily in general. Separate bathrooms for colored people and white people. White people got to sit in the front of the bus and black people got to sit in the back. If the bus is full and a black person is sitting, if a white person gets on, they have to move so that the white person can sit. If I wanted to go into a restaurant, I would have to go into the back restaurant to be fed food because I cannot sit at the front in the window and be seen served as black. Everything is separated down the middle. But the one thing that this segregation does is allow for a vulnerability of, for the exploitation of human rights of blacks in the South. So for instance, unequal voting rights, denied Social Security benefits, all sorts of things of ways that blacks can be exploited in the South because of Jim Crow. So there was a lot of unwritten norms or social rules because of segregation. Those are laws on paper, right? Like I could be convicted of not moving, which is what Rosa Parks did, right? A white person asked her to move, she said, I'm not moving. So that's the law. But other rules are, when I'm walking down the street, I don't look white people in the face. You answer ma'am, sir, which is a South custom anyways. There's certain unwritten rules. So Emmett Till's mother said, all right, I'll let you go, but please be respectful. Be respectful of everyone, especially white people, be respectful. He said, I'll go. So he goes with his cousins. One day he's with his cousins at a drugstore, and there's debate about this, but the common knowledge is that Emmett Till did have a really bad whistle. And he's 14 years old, and he had a really bad stutter, And he could not say his B's very well. So his mom said, well, whistle to get it out. So if you start to whistle, then you will start to say the B sound. And there's debate about that. But anyways, Emmett Till is with his cousins. He's at a drugstore, and he whistles at a white woman walking by. She goes into the drugstore. She tells her husband. Emmett and his cousins continue leaving the drugstore. They go home. At 2 a.m. that morning, 3 white men came and took Emmett Till out of his bed of his uncle's house. They beat him for hours. They shot him and then threw his body in the river. And when they entered their house, they said, "Are you the one that whistled at that white lady at the drugstore?" And he said, "Yes." And thus, his death came shortly after. Now, there's a lot of connections that can be made to his murder and Trayvon's murder. But there's a lot of things that, you could sort of say are different, right? But in my opinion, in looking at both were killed for being black, both were killed for doing things that a black person should or should not do, whether that's walking around in a neighborhood in the rain or whistling at a white woman. They were underage children, black males who were killed. And a lot of people made these connections, not just me. This is it's not highly known, but it's fairly known. And I'm an African American studies major, so it's very known. But the one thing I also want to make a connection to is that both mothers of Emmett Till wanted their dead bodies' images circulated because they wanted the horror of hatred to be shown. Emmett Till's mother, Emmett on the left, she had an open casket. They shipped his body from Mississippi once they found it in the river, and she had an open casket because she wanted the whole world to know what hatred looked like and what Jim Crow laws have done, what segregation has done in the South. This is Trayvon Martin as well. His mom didn't circulate that, but she also did not disagree with that image being put out shortly thereafter. I didn't see this, though, till the not guilty verdict, so maybe that was a very decisive thing on the part of them, but I did not see this until after the not guilty verdict, so if he was guilty, I don't know if I would have seen it. In looking at this hatred, right, and looking at these murders, it's very important for me to explain how segregation and racism are coded in us because of how we feel about difference and how we're coded to feel about difference. This one is really good too because this is a picture of segregation in the South, how you have to use the colored water fountain and this is the white water fountain, and don't be caught dead even thinking you're gonna look at this water fountain and use it. This is yours, this is your bathroom, this, that, and the other. Another quick thing that's not related to this, but you should know this, is that there's this idea of separate but equal. So this also started up after slavery. So it's like the idea of, well, we can have things separate. Blacks do this and whites do this, but it'll be equal. This, if you can see, this is how equal it is, right? And this is how, right down to school systems, buses, bathrooms, everything. It's separate, but it's not necessarily equal. It doesn't look as nice. And that can play in the psyche of a black person in the South as well, but it's meant to. And so these are just pictures in case you guys don't have a context of what segregation is in the South. It's very important for you guys to understand the legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and now, in my opinion, globalization. The legacy, there is a tie there. And so I want to read Bell Hooks. I like to call her a theorist, and she's also a writer. She has a better explanation that I want to read to you guys about why murders and violence today can harken back to slavery or a legacy of our history, right? And I just want to read it really quick. Culturally, we bear witness to this madness every day. We can all tell endless stories of how it makes itself known in everyday life. For example, an adult white male answers the door when a young Asian male rings the bell. We live in a culture where, without responding to any gesture of aggression or hostility on the part of the stranger, who is simply lost and trying to find the correct address, the white male shoots him, believing he is protecting his life and his property. This is an everyday example of madness. The person who is really the threat here is the homeowner who has been so well socialized by thinking of white supremacy, of capitalism, of patriarchy, that he can no longer respond rationally. White supremacy has taught him that all people of color are threats irrespective of their behavior. Capitalism has taught him that at all costs, his property can and be protected. Patriarchy has taught him that his masculinity has to be proved by the willingness to conquer fear through aggression. That would be unmanly to ask questions before taking action. Mass media then brings us the news of this in a newspeak manner that sounds almost jocular and celebratory, as though no tragedy has happened, as though the sacrifice of a young life was necessary to uphold property values. White patriarchal honor. Views are encouraged to feel sympathy for the white male homeowner who made a mistake. The fact that this mistake led to the violent death of an innocent young man does not register. The narrative is worded in a manner that encourages viewers to identify with the one who made the mistake by doing what we are led to feel we might all do to protect our property at all costs from any sense of perceived threat. This is what the worship of death looks like. And I love the way she writes, so I always try to incorporate her at some point. In regards to segregation, it's not really talked about when we take history classes in America, but it's a point of segregation. It's not my favorite point, but it's the point I like to ride a lot because it's something that I feel is unique to the whole American history situation, which is at the end of slavery in 1865, right? What brought about the end of slavery is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It is only until the machine is proven to outwork a slave that the idea of slavery starts to come about. And this is also in England as well. England likes to be like, no, we ended slavery first. Well, you had machines, so. And only then does the discussion start to be about ending slavery. And then once day one happens, all of a sudden, these horrible people had slavery going on. It's like, that was yesterday, you know? So, how do you ease people? In the South, slavery in America was a big part of the capitalist economy, Free labor. You can make anything, grow anything, do anything with free labor. So how do you coach or coax people to be okay with that? You know, how do you get people to understand? A lot of people were poor at the end of slavery because they had to then now supposedly pay for labor, which that had its rocky road as well with sharecropping and other things. Okay, so in my opinion, one of the ways you do it is with segregation, okay? You can tell white people, well, yes, you are white, and yes, you are broke, and yes, slavery is over, but you don't share a bathroom with a black person. You don't live as bad as a black person does. You have more rights than a black person does. Someone you thought was property just years ago. Someone who could not think for himself was better off working and being a servant unto others. You don't share a seat with that person, right? And that's what segregation does. You can say that it coaxes you out of slavery, or you can say that it further reiterates and codes in us this idea about being afraid of difference, about being afraid of that which is different from you. So I just think that's an important part of segregation. There's many other reasons for segregation. There's all kinds of things, but that is my point to make with people, is that I can still walk down the street and know that I am better than someone, even with the end of slavery. Yeah, I'm talking about the American South, and I don't want to be as arrogant to say I can make this a world discussion. But we do see this in Israel, in South Africa, in Australia. It's the same heart of difference, right? And the same idea of segregation and the same heritage that we get from imperialism, colonialism, and in my opinion, globalization. This idea that keeps this fear of difference. And so we have to act violence upon it. The one thing that at Columbia they taught us was that you can't have a discussion about racism without talking about sexism. And you can't talk about racism and sexism without talking about the limitations of class onto both. And so, you know, they kind of beat us in this. Don't try to just, you know, have a race conversation. Don't just try to have a sexism conversation, because all of those isms are in place to oppress for a reason. Now, after 2 days, I know I don't have to tell you guys what those reasons are. You guys know very well the benefits of oppression, right? And very well the benefits of class limitations. So I'm not gonna patronize you that way. The one thing that I wanna talk about too is shortly after the verdict, me and my friends got together and was like, what is the White House gonna say? Come on, Obama, what you gonna say? So we were waiting around and I'm like, come on, what? Come on. So, and so I want to read his statement. So President Obama says, the death of Trayvon Martin was a tragedy, not just for his family or any one community, but for America. I know this case has elicited strong passions, and in the wake of the verdict, I know these passions may be running even higher. But we are a nation of laws, and a jury has spoken. I now ask every American to respect the call for calm reflection from two parents who lost their young son. And as we do, we should ask ourselves if we are doing all we can to widen the circle of compassion and understanding in our own communities. We should ask ourselves if we're doing all we can to stem the tide of gun violence that claims too many lives across this country on a daily basis. We should ask ourselves as individuals and as a society, how can we prevent tragedies like this? As citizens, that's a job for all of us. That's the way to honor Trayvon Martin. And so a friend of mine called me up, and I was working or something, so I didn't hear it. And she called me up, and she was like, I'm going to the White House. Are you coming with me? And I was just like, wait, what did he say? What did he say? She's like, nothing. And I was like, oh no. And so I'm not that good at when people, and I know I've read to you a lot today. When people read to me, I'm just like, yeah, where's the picture? So I don't really, I'm just like, yeah, okay. So I was just like, don't tell me, let me get home and get on the computer. And I read it, scoured it, and was very disappointed because no mention of race today in society, no mention of the length we have to go in America today, and then you mention gun violence. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, George Zimmerman has a right in America to bear arms. He has the right to have the 9mm on him. If he did not use the gun on Trayvon, there still was an atrocity that occurred by getting out of the car and questioning a person for being black in his neighborhood, in my opinion. And so whether he shot him or not, whether they fought or not, before that even happened, Trayvon was a victim of racism in America in 2013. And that was the biggest problem. Barack Obama, while this was all shaking out from February when George Zimmerman was charged till the verdict, has said two statements. One, he said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And a second statement that he has said is that I would have been Trayvon in my younger years. Why? Because you wear hoodies? Because you like Skittles? No, because you were racially profiled in America is why. And then your statement has no mention of it. And so I had a discussion with one of my friends about this because I was like, yeah, but you know, he's just not the president for black people. He's the president for all of America, and he's got to da-da-da-da. And he's like, this is his second term. He's not going to get reelected. He could have took a stand. And I'm like, yeah, you're kind of right. So now I'm like, yeah, damn him, you know? So all of this right now got me thinking about difference, right? And the legacy of difference. And so that's what got me to the title of my presentation, which I didn't mention, which was Stuart Hall, who is like one of the fathers of cultural studies, which is my degrees in, out of London, said, he has this quote that I love, which is, I am from the moment of birth, from my entry into language, dependent on that which is different from me. And that to me is important because it's not just like, oh, I love other cultures or I want to learn how you celebrate things, your customs. No, I am dependent on the way that you are different from me. There would be no me if you did not differ from me, right? And so that's what I kind of wanted to express to you guys, is to change the way you feel about difference, all differences, as much stuff as we've talked about for 2 days. All the differences is to understand that you need it to exist. You need it to survive. You need to be dependent on that difference. And in my opinion, if you then look at it that way, your feeling towards things that are different from you will change. It's no longer scary at that point if you need it, right? What my main point is I'm very concerned about cultural assimilation. I'm very concerned about multicultural days where we all sort of blend everything together as this one homogenous group, and instead of celebrating the ways that we differ in a real respectful way. in a real genuine and interested way of respecting the way we differ. Not in a way of, I don't see color, which is the most, I hate when people tell me that. I don't see color. No, see that I am black. See that I am the descendant of a former slave. Yes, I would like you to acknowledge it, but for that reason, don't think that I can't work as hard as you can, or I'm not as smart as you can, or that I'm going to be late to everything because I'm black. But no, oh, Ayondela, yes, she's black, and a black American. Yes, that's okay to acknowledge. That doesn't offend me, but don't make assumptions. Allow me to present to you who I am, right? And that's what I do with everyone. Yes, I notice that you're Latina, I hear your accent, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to then go, well, what's Cinco de Mayo? Can you explain that to me? No, I'm not. You show me your identity, and you show me who you are. I'm gonna just sit and wait. I can wait. And know that you are different. I am me because you are different from me. Stuart Hall also has this idea in a lot of his conversations about culture isn't everything, right? But culture is a dimension of everything. And so if you want to know what people feel, you go to the culture. You go to the way we play, you go to the way we laugh, and you look at what we're thinking and what our fears are. And so in my opinion, that's why I address this, because I feel like we have a lot of deep fears about difference because we're afraid of being swallowing up. And we're afraid of that because we could be swallowed up, and you can evaporate if you do not. But in my opinion, you don't go on the offensive and then try to delete everything else that is out there, because in that instance, you will then also be deleted. In my opinion, I've always, as a bachelor, getting my bachelor's, I don't know if this is my idea or if the school ingrained this in me, but we're all scientists, right? And the world is your lab, you know, your local community is your lab, you're observant, you see things, you're immediately eager to speak up and say what you observe. As a scientist, when you approach your subject, approach it with a deliberate and critical eye, but with a very careful and respectful heart. I think that's very important. I don't know if anyone's ever taken a class on ethnography, but that is their main deal, you know. It's like be mindful of what the outsider is and what that means and who is the outsider and what place are you writing from. You know, it's very important to be reflexive, to know your position in your research. But in my opinion, it's also just as important as to be careful, have a very careful heart, and to be very respectful of your subject, respectful of yourselves, and respectful of the research. You've done the work. You just have to trust your training. Also, too, the fear of difference. You can see the dog attacking the black male here. But also, too, just this week, 500 deaths in Cairo. 500 deaths in Cairo. And so, in my opinion, this is what fear looks like, in my opinion. That's how I read it. I hate reading the news, but when I do, I'm just like, we're all scared. And we're all told to be scared. And scared about what? Difference, in my opinion. It's definitely scared if you're not prepared for change. And then you get really scared, and then you get really angry, right? Because you were tricked into being scared. And then you're so angry that you can't keep it to yourself, and you have to let it out, and you have to make an action on it, right? And so, in my opinion, we need to change how we feel. Change how we feel about difference. So I was thinking about the themes of the conference and thinking about stewardship of the planet, right? You can't talk about stewardship of the planet unless you're talking about belonging. So for instance, with segregation in the South, if I am denied the planet, if I am denied access, right? Or in Africa, if I'm denied clean water or fresh food, then when it's time to save it, don't ask me for help. I'm denied access to my own planet. I'm denied access to go freely where I want to go. And so you can't talk about stewardship of the planet without talking about belonging and otherness. And in talking about the future of culture, media, and technology, which is another theme, you can't talk about it without talking about how the other has found a way to make space into it with YouTube and Facebook. And again, this is one of those things where you don't have to, but it's very important to try to see how they all interconnect. These things are not just selected out of happenstance. It's to understand how they all relate and how they all affect us in some way. The Tomorrow Ideas Now conference is really asking us like one thing. I was reading like all the stuff, all the criteria that you could submit an abstract, and they're really asking one thing. How do we best adapt to change? How do we get on the forefront of it? How are we facilitators of change? How are we able to do better, be better, right? And I think that's with inclusion. I think that's with changing how we feel about difference. So it's just very interesting the ways in which we can sort of move into a public space. It sounds kind of corny, but I really want you guys to try to think about using your talent, your gifts to come together, okay? To work with people who also share those same talents, get honest feedback about it, and then dedicate those talents and gifts that you have to change. Any sort of change, any sort of growth, really. It's really easier than what you might think. The Kule Institute really started a legacy today in believing in students, believing in thinking, believing in thinkers and sharing ideas. So I kind of wanted to just make a challenge to accept the gift, go back to your local communities, and also believe in students around you, also believe in sharing ideas. You can persist with your passion, apply the knowledge you were given, accept your training, trust your training, know that you're not right, but you're very interested. You're curious. You want to know about the world, and you know you're dependent on the differences, right? And then once you apply the knowledge, dedicate it to change.